Greetings, PARM 2223. This is our last lecture, or series of lectures, for Unit 15. As I pop that refreshing beverage, I'll let you guess what it is. Unit 15 for your class. And this topic is one that I enjoy every year, and I call it Future EMS. So this is really about, this whole week is about you, the future of the profession you're joining in, and stuff like that. So I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the future innovations that are coming. But this module, the discussion boards, everything, really a lot of it apply to the type of medic you're going to be going forward, and just to get you thinking of a few things beyond protocols and beyond the next few weeks. So let's get on to it. No quiz. These notes will be posted, but there'll only be a very couple things that you will absolutely need to know for the test, and that will be in the very first portion of this lecture and the very first module, next few slides. But other than that, this is just discussion. So sit back, enjoy, grab a tasty beverage, and enjoy this. So a couple basic concepts. When we talk about future EMS, we're talking about future innovations. So this is Rogers' innovation curve. Now, Rogers developed this in 1962 and has been copied, plagiarized, adapted, innovated back and forth over and over and over again for the past, 40, 50 years, because it works. Okay, and this bell curve that you see here is the innovation adoption cycle. So on the very front end, let me get my little dot here, my little laser pointer. On the front end right here, you will see the early innovators, also known as sometimes the bleeding edge. Sometimes you call it the cutting edge. Sometimes we like to refer to this as bleeding edge because a lot of mistakes also happen here. But this is when you hear about things like Reboa, when you hear about things like pre-hospital ECMO, that is where this is in this early innovation. Then we have the early adopters, where the efficacy has been proven, but not everybody is quite on board yet. And this is where we start hearing things. I'm trying to think of an example of early adopters. I would say probably community paramedicine is still in the early adopter phase. Then we have the early majority, and this is where most of us hope our agencies are, if not in the early adopter. We like to be an early adopter, but there's still mistakes. The early majority is this: the concept's been proven, it's been accepted, it's a best practice, but not everybody is on board. So a good example of that would be perhaps I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I hate to say not transporting cardiac arrest, because in our area it's pretty standard, but there are parts of the country where if they work you, they transport you still, especially on the East Coast. So they're starting to get hip to the game, so I'd put them in the late majority, and some of the stragglers like in New York City, definitely in the laggard perspective. Now, where do you want to be in innovation? Well, I guess that just depends on where you and your organization are comfortable with risk. Certainly in the innovators, somebody has to innovate. Somebody has to do the research, somebody has to have the concept, so on and so forth. But is that the role for early MS? Maybe, maybe not. Early adopters? Yeah. There's a lot we can do. You look at telestroke, you look at telemedicine, you look at EMS. I hate using the term EMS initiated refusals, because I think that's inverting the decision process. But there certainly is, we talk about that. Definitely ideally you want to be in the early adopter and early majority portion. This is where a lot of the other ones are, and you don't ever want to be here as you move forward and as you think about this. So as we talk about these different things, think about where the process is, like if we talk about Reboa, we talk about ECMO, we talk about blood, think about where that is on this curve. And then the next thing I want to do, you think about, is dependencies. Now, I mentioned this in the discussion board. Dependencies are things that are required for the innovation to take hold and to spread. Without the dependency, the innovation stalls or doesn't happen. Does that make sense? So with the dependency, the process moves forward. And This is one way. There's different models to look at dependencies. This is one way, the different phases. We call it the 4Ds of the dependencies of evolution. When you look at the 4Ds, the first one is dependent. It's heavily dependent. It's rare. It's experimental. It's dependent on specialty expertise and resources that are not common by any stretch of the imagination. Then it begins to decouple from these specialized dependencies. It's still dependent on a lot of things, but it begins to decouple. So you start seeing it, you start seeing development begin independent of the early innovators. Other people are replicating the research. Other people are looking for ways to expand this into their practice outside of the lab. In distribution, it's become standard practice, but it's not everywhere. It becomes scalable. It's reliable. It's reproducible. It's resilient under a wide variety of circumstances. It's now mainstream. You start seeing best practices, position papers and such being developed about it. And then you have the democratization. And again, we're not just talking about medicine. We're talking about lots of different things. This is where the distribution, everything gets to this final stage, but where distribution becomes decentralized. Everybody's doing research on it or innovating it. Everybody is mimicking it. It's becoming miniaturized. It's becoming mass produced. It's becoming refined, and then it's branching out into its own specialties that are dependent and then have to be decoupled and then have to be distributed and then become democratized themselves. Kind of see how that works. So let's, and I'm really not trying to bore you with this. This does pertain. So let's take a look at the next section. Here's an example that we all should be familiar with. Books. In the very 1200s, 1100s, even before, books were the province of the elite, the rich, and the church. When you had them, they were representative of your power and your wealth and a status. Books and scrolls and such took months or even years to make, and they were done by hand by specialists. In the 1200s, we had block printing, and then I believe 16 or 1700s, we had the printing press had developed. So we went from hand-drawn specialty manuscripts that were reproduced by hand, that only the very rich who were literate could read. We saw literacy spread, and with this, we could say literacy was a dependency of the print, of the printed word, the written word. We started seeing early mass production of printing. It became cheaper, but it was still fragile. It was still somewhat expensive. And then as it became cheaper, or there became a profit incentive, we see the distribution phase happen, where it becomes more affordable. Newspapers, pamphlets, paperback books. And I'm not talking about modern times. You saw pamphlets. If you think back to Benjamin Franklin, and was it the Do-Good letters, I think they were called? And the early days of Revolutionary War, newspapers were common then. Educate and dependent on this, of course, is literacy, and education and books in turn both become widely distributed. And now we have the written word and education democratized. We have self-publishing. You can self-publish your book. We have digital books. Anybody can write, anybody can create, and anybody can distribute. We have widespread basic literacy throughout the world. Yes, there are areas where we could still do work, but generally speaking, most people can read and write in the industrialized, developed world. Becomes cheap. It becomes miniaturized. Now we have Kindles that you can carry thousands of books on. It becomes competitive. That's the prime example. So let's take a look at this one more time with the internet. In the 1960s, we had ARPANET, which was purely a Department of Defense top secret project, closely guarded. Only not only the people that that could understand, that could write, that could work in this were a very specialized group of computer scientists, and very dependent on finite resources. In the 1980s, it began to be decoupled from its dependencies as protocols were standardized. The BBSs began to spring up in not community colleges and universities that were research centers for computer science. And if you don't know what BBS was, it's a bulletin board system or bulletin board server, where you literally picked up your phone, you did the rotary dial, you plugged it into the wall, and you dialed in, and you could read text-based format, a paragraph or whatever somebody wrote on whatever topic, and you could reply or not, whatever. And that's basically, that was 1980s. I remember some of that. The dial-up. In the 1990s, the World Wide Web became a thing, and we had the World Wide Web consortium that developed standards of best practices. They developed HTTP, the early version of HTTP. It was called something different. I don't remember what it was now. As standard coding, they standardized it, and that was the first steps of distribution. And then by the late 90s and early 2000s, we started seeing it democratized. In 2009, we had the World Wide Web Foundation with net neutrality. And now we see where internet is, where anybody can log on. They can create their own website. They can publish stuff. That's where in medicine, at the end of this lecture, we'll talk about foam and how free open access medical education is directly a result of the democratization of the internet. All this does apply to what we're doing. So let's take a look at something that's very clinical. Blood products. We've talked about this. In the very early stages of blood product administration, as in the 1700s and so, it was cutting edge. It was dangerous. It's the province of very few physicians and not anatomical scientists, physicists, or physiologists, I should say, anatomist, and was fraught with risk. In the late stages of World War I and World War II, we start seeing become more widespread. War was the catalyst that moved it forward into the decoupling stage. And a lot of these, as we go back, we can point to different events that were catalysts toward it moving forward to the next stage. It became less dependent on specialist physicians, and where general practice physicians, surgeons, specially trained nurses could administer it. It was still rare, it was still expensive, and it still had risk, diseases, so on and so forth. But we see it decoupling from the dependencies of the previous era. Here we are in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Distribution becomes more widespread, and the catalyst here is cost and standardization. Blood banks with standardized best practices and guidelines were developed, safer to administer with filtration and plasmapheresis. Now, supply is still limited and still costly. So the next step is, what about democratization? Hasn't blood been democratized? Or hasn't it been reached the next stage? And the answer is no, it hasn't. Because we haven't reached blood substitutes that can be mass produced yet. Although we've talked about in the very early parts of this class, we talked about some things that show a lot of promise. It hasn't been customizable yet. But the cost and production and storage are dropping, and there are things that are moving forward that. So we're seeing the transition between distribution and democratization of blood product administration for healthcare. And this is not, very few things can say you're squarely here, squarely here. This is a spectrum. But the reason why I'm talking about this is as we move forward, you need to understand this so that we can, as we look at different innovations we're about to look at. Does that make sense? So as I look at each of these innovations, I want you to ask yourself, where in the innovation curve do you think it is? Where in the 4Ds do you think it is? And where do you want to be? And more importantly, I should put this on here, what is going to be the catalyst to push it to the next step? Now, the catalyst can be a profit motive. It can be a profit crunch where it can be a resource crunch. I'll give you a prime example. Right now, we're all watching this. We're doing distributed education. Distributed education has been around in one form or another since the 1800s in the form of correspondence courses. Modern distributed education since the 1990s. But it was in very limited application. Higher education on a limited basis, so on and so forth. Now everybody's doing it. So what was the catalyst? COVID-19 was the catalyst. So keep these type of things in mind just to get your brain churning. And you're thinking, why is this important to me as I'm about to graduate paramedic school? because you're about to graduate paramedic school. You're about to enter this amazing, noble, dynamic profession, and I really hope that as we move forward, you contribute to it. And to do that, you need to understand the macro view. You need to have some metacognition about what the profession is and what it can become, not just about the next call. So that's going to be the first part. I'm going to go ahead and we'll see you back here in a few minutes with part 2 of this lecture. Thank you.